The Little Priests of Violence. On the commentators who discover morality only when empire itself feels unsafe. By Elias Winter, April 28, 2026. Read by an automated voice. 1. The Choir of Respectable Ghouls. They came quickly, as they always do. Before the smoke had fully entered the archive, before the facts had hardened into sequence, before any human being had been permitted the privacy of an unprocessed reaction, they arrived with their grave little faces and their clean microphones and their moral sorrow already warmed to room temperature. The respectable ghouls, the podcast men, the democracy mourners, the former architects of catastrophe now employed as custodians of decency, the newspaper moralists whose sentences smell faintly of old mahogany, catered panels, and sanctioned blood, the men who have spent their lives near power and somehow mistaken that proximity for conscience. They leaned toward the camera. They lowered their voices. They performed the sacrament. First, let me say, I condemn political violence. How brave, how costly, how astonishing to watch courage take such strenuous form. A man in a studio chair, speaking into a microphone, denouncing assassination between sponsor breaks, while the empire he has spent his career defending continues its work with drones, prisons, sanctions, contractors, border camps, intelligence memos, and beautifully typeset euphemisms. One almost wants to applaud the heroism. There he is, the reasonable man, the moderate executioner of language, trembling before the possibility that violence has entered the room where important people gather. Not violence in the abstract, of course. Not violence as policy. Not violence as blockade, starvation, detention, bombing, extraction, regime discipline, or the slow crushing of foreign bodies beneath the vocabulary of strategic necessity. No, that kind of violence requires nuance. This violence had violated etiquette. It had come too close to the podium. And so the little priests emerged. They spoke of norms. They spoke of democracy. They spoke of decency. They spoke of the republic as though it were a chapel and not a machine that has spent generations manufacturing graves abroad and euphemisms at home. They wore concern like vestments. Their faces tightened into the appropriate geometry of seriousness. They reminded the public, as priests must, that the first duty of the citizen is to recite the creed. I condemn political violence. Very good. Now say it again. Say it before thinking. Say it before grieving. Say it before asking why some violence becomes a crisis of civilization while other violence becomes a budget line. Say it so the gatekeepers know you are safe. Say it so the commentators can nod solemnly and allow you to continue. The problem is not that they condemn violence. The problem is that violence only becomes visible to them when it threatens the architecture that keeps them employed. They are not horrified by blood. They are horrified by disorder. They are not guardians of human life. They are guardians of institutional tone. They do not object to the machinery of death. They object when death forgets its manners. And so they speak. The man from the respectable anti-populist chapel, forever wounded by vulgarity, but rarely by empire, speaks. The column-writing heir of the old interventionist conscience, who summons dead philosophers like character witnesses for his own moral refinement, speaks. The newspaper that helped teach a generation how to call war prudence speaks. The panel guests speak. The democracy mourners speak. The bipartisan custodians of acceptable sorrow speak. And beneath them, the machine continues. Bombs become defense. Sanctions become pressure. Camps become enforcement. Theft becomes strategy. Domination becomes order. But let a bullet move toward power, and suddenly the room fills with theologians. 2. The ritual disclaimer. "I condemn political violence" is not a sentence anymore. It is a password. It is the phrase one must recite before being permitted to think in public. It is the moral equivalent of removing one's shoes before entering the temple of respectable discourse. It does not clarify. It does not deepen. It does not mourn. It certifies. The phrase performs 3 tasks. First, it marks the speaker as safe. Not good, not honest, not serious. Safe. It tells the gatekeepers that the speaker has no intention of disturbing the emotional architecture of the moment. He will not ask inconvenient questions too soon. He will not widen the frame prematurely. He will not compare visible violence to invisible violence. He will not bring the empire into the room. Second, it protects the speaker from suspicion. In a degraded moral culture, explanation is treated as sympathy, context as endorsement, analysis as treason. To think beyond the immediate event is to risk being accused of secretly desiring it. So the ritual disclaimer functions as prophylaxis. It is a little moral raincoat worn before entering the contaminated weather of public interpretation. Third, it narrows the field of concern. Once the correct sentence is spoken, the event is placed into the approved container. Political violence, extremism, danger to democracy, rhetoric gone too far. All of which may be true. But the ritual does not invite thought. It limits it. It says, here is the boundary. Stay inside it. What disappears is the surrounding world. The ritual does not ask what kind of civilization produces men who seek meaning through violence. It does not ask why despair becomes theatrical. It does not ask why some people feel history only when they interrupt it with blood. It does not ask why the public has been trained to experience politics as apocalypse, entertainment, humiliation, vengeance, and tribal sacrament. Most of all, it does not ask what kinds of violence are already authorized. That is the central convenience. To condemn an isolated act of violence requires almost nothing. It risks nothing. It costs nothing. It asks nothing of the speaker except a clean face and the correct tone. But to condemn the system of violence that feeds him, publishes him, protects him, flatters him, and rewards him, that would be something else entirely. That would require exile from the dinner. That would require losing invitations. That would require naming friends. That would require saying that the polite vocabulary of the powerful is often more dangerous than the obscenity of the deranged. So the sentence remains useful. I condemn political violence. It means I am not one of the dangerous people. It means I understand the rules. It means I will not confuse this incident with the larger order. It means I will not ask why violence committed by the state is processed as governance, while violence committed against the state is processed as metaphysical emergency. The little priests do not condemn violence. They manage the boundaries of permissible disgust. 3. The geography of moral feeling. Their morality has a map. It has borders, passports, preferred accents, strategic exceptions, and approved victims. It knows which dead deserve names and which dead deserve context. It knows which children are mourned and which are absorbed into the tragic complexity of regional affairs. It knows which blood stains the conscience and which blood stains only the paperwork. A president hurried from danger becomes a crisis of the republic. A child beneath rubble becomes a difficult situation. A podium trembles, and civilization is in peril. A city is starved, and experts gather to discuss proportionality. A shot near power becomes evil. A bomb dropped from power becomes policy. This is not moral seriousness. It is geography. The respectable commentators do not respond to violence as violence. They respond according to distance, narrative usefulness, and institutional allegiance. Domestic violence, especially when aimed upward, becomes sacred theater. It receives atmosphere. It receives solemn music. It receives the full cathedral treatment, democracy, decency, norms, the soul of the nation. Imperial violence receives vocabulary, collateral damage, security concerns, regional stability, counterterrorism, strategic interests, deterrence, difficult choices, humanitarian concerns, necessary pressure. There is no end to the tenderness of language when power needs its hands washed. A fisherman killed by empire is not a martyr. He is an incident. A schoolchild killed under the shadow of geopolitical discipline is not a universe extinguished. She is an unfortunate consequence. A family destroyed by sanctions is not evidence of cruelty. It is pressure applied to a regime. A village erased by military necessity is not political violence. It is the fog of war. But let violence approach the class that narrates violence, and suddenly every abstract noun puts on mourning clothes. They do not lack moral categories. They ration them. This is why their outrage feels obscene. Not because the event is meaningless. It is not meaningless. A human being who turns toward assassination has entered a zone of ruin. A society in which politics becomes murder is sick. A public life organized around humiliation and revenge will eventually produce men who mistake violence for speech. That much is true. But it is not more true because the target is powerful. It is not more true because the room was important. It is not more true because the commentators can imagine themselves nearby. The dead abroad do not become less dead because their names are harder to pronounce. The imprisoned do not become less human because their suffering arrives through reports rather than sirens. The bombed do not become morally smaller because they are killed under flags that respectable people have learned to trust. A civilization reveals itself not only by what it mourns, but by what it can discuss without trembling. And these people can discuss mass death with astonishing composure. They can weigh civilian casualties against objectives. They can debate starvation as leverage. They can treat detention as administration. They can turn invaded countries into chessboards, oil fields into strategic assets, refugees into burdens, and corpses into regrettable necessities. But when danger comes near the symbolic body of power, they rediscover the 10 Commandments. The empire has always had priests. Some bless the weapons, some bless the language. The second group is more dangerous because they believe themselves innocent. 4. The Clown and the Machine. The clown is real. That is the trap. He really is grotesque. He really is vain, theatrical, vulgar, cruel, ridiculous, absurd. He speaks like appetite found a microphone. He turns public life into insult, grievance, spectacle, merchandise, and domination. He is not a symbol accidentally mistaken for a man. He is a man who has spent his life turning himself into a symbol because symbols are easier to sell than souls. But the mistake is to confuse the mask with the machine. The hatred of him is useful. The love of him is useful. Both place him at the center of history. Both make him the explanation. His followers imagine him as sovereign will, the rough prophet of a betrayed people, the strong man who will punish their humiliators. His enemies imagine him as the singular source of corruption, the orange infection, the obscene exception, the monster who arrived from outside the republic and deformed it. Both are childish. Both flatter the system. He did not invent the hunger for domination. He did not invent the billionaire capture of politics. He did not invent executive overreach, border cruelty, imperial extraction, media spectacle, religious hypocrisy, financialized despair, or the conversion of public life into entertainment. He gave these forces a face so vulgar that no one could look away. That is his function. The clown absorbs attention that would otherwise have to move toward structure. The oligarchy benefits, the security state benefits, the contractors benefit, the donors benefit, the media benefits, the commentators benefit, everyone benefits from the simplification. The entire rotting architecture can be explained through one man's appetite. The public is invited to scream at the painted face while the gears continue their patient work behind it. The genius of the arrangement is that the clown is not fake. He is genuinely grotesque. Precisely because he is grotesque, he becomes the perfect vessel for a system that would rather be hated through a person than understood as a structure. This is why the commentator class needs him. They need him as villain, subject, revenue model, absolution. He allows the respectable right to reinvent itself without accounting for the wars it blessed, the austerity it justified, the cruelty it normalized, the imperial fantasies it carried like holy fire. He allows the institutional center to pretend that democracy was healthy until vulgarity entered the room. He allows the newspaper moralist to condemn barbarism without investigating the civilized barbarism that preceded it. The clown is useful to everyone. His supporters pour their longings into him. His enemies pour their innocence into him. And behind both groups stands the machine, amused. The machine does not care whether you love the mask or hate it. It only cares that you keep mistaking the mask for the source of power. It only cares that you keep treating politics as personality, collapse as temperament, oligarchy as charisma, empire as one man's mood. The clown is not a distraction from power. He is power's preferred costume. 5. The empire's clean hands. The empire does not need all its servants to be sadists. It needs many of them to be reasonable. It needs men who can sit calmly under studio lights and describe cruelty as necessity. It needs columnists who can make domination sound tragic but mature. It needs editors who know which verbs to soften. It needs panelists who can distinguish, with great seriousness, between unacceptable violence and regrettable force. It needs people whose moral imaginations activate only when power is threatened, not when power acts. The empire's genius has never been merely violence. It is cleanliness, the clean sentence, the clean office, the clean justification. The clean hand extended after the dirty work has been assigned elsewhere. No one says torture when enhanced techniques will do. No one says starvation when pressure is available. No one says theft when strategic interest has such an adult sound. No one says empire when rules-based order still fits in the mouth. No one says massacre if a more technical phrase can survive the editorial process. The commentator's role is not always to cheer violence. That would be too crude. Often the role is simply to make violence sound governable, to ensure that brutality enters the public mind wearing a tie, to convert screams into questions of policy, to help the educated reader feel informed rather than implicated. This is the true obscenity of respectability. The vulgar man says the ugly thing plainly. Take the oil, punish them, crush them, humiliate them, Make them pay. The respectable man recoils from the vulgarity, then arrives at a similar destination through better syntax. He does not speak of plunder. He speaks of leverage. He does not speak of domination. He speaks of stability. He does not speak of killing. He speaks of hard choices. He does not speak of obedience. He speaks of order. The clean hand is often just the hand that has learned to outsource the blood. This is why their moral lectures are intolerable. Not because every condemnation they offer is false, but because the speaker has been trained to see only certain forms of violence as morally disqualifying. The rest becomes context. The rest becomes complexity. The rest becomes the tragic burden of serious people. Serious people have always been dangerous. Not passionate people, not angry people, not broken people shouting in the street. Serious people. The ones who know how to sit still while the map is divided. The ones who know how to say regrettable without changing course. The ones who understand that a dead child is not necessarily an argument if the policy objective remains intact. The empire loves such people. It promotes them. It prints them. It invites them to panels about democracy. It places them in conversation with one another so they may admire the shared discipline of never following their own moral vocabulary to its conclusion. This is not hypocrisy in the ordinary sense. Hypocrisy still implies some relationship to a standard. What we are seeing is more advanced. It is the professional management of moral asymmetry. It is not failure to live up to a creed. It is the invention of a creed whose exemptions are built in. 6. The New York Times hawk and the theft of Arendt. There is a special kind of obscenity in watching a court intellectual of respectable violence borrow from Hannah Arendt. Not because Arendt belongs to no one. Great thought survives by being used, but there is use, and there is grave robbing. Arendt wrote of evil stripped of Gothic glamour, evil without horns, evil without the grand theater by which the wicked often flatter themselves, evil as procedure, obedience, career, administration, thoughtlessness. Evil as a man doing his job inside a system whose premises he does not seriously examine. Evil as the collapse of judgment beneath the comfort of function. The banality of evil was not an invitation for every polished defender of aligned power to accuse his enemies of moral vacancy while exempting his own machinery from scrutiny. It was a warning. And yet, the respectable columnist reaches for her anyway. He reaches for Arendt, as one reaches for silverware at a formal dinner. Not trembling, not ashamed, not aware, perhaps, of the irony sitting beside him like a ghost. He invokes the language of ordinary complicity while participating in a tradition that has made ordinary complicity its professional method. This is the theft. A concept meant to expose systemic moral blindness is redeployed as a weapon against disapproved actors, while the systems favored by the speaker are protected from the same examination. Evil is banal over there. Evil is bureaucratic over there. Evil is thoughtless over there. Evil is obedience over there. Here it is complexity. Here it is security. Here it is the difficult burden of civilization defending itself. Here the dead require footnotes. Whether Arendt herself would have said this or that about the present arrangement is not the point. The dead should not be turned into puppets for contemporary arguments. The point is simpler and more damning. The habits of mind she warned against are alive precisely in the respectable language that now claims her authority. The bureaucrat does not always wear a uniform. Sometimes he writes a column. Sometimes he appears under the seal of the great newspaper. Sometimes he speaks in the tone of a man saddened by necessity. Sometimes he believes himself brave, because he has denounced the obvious villain, while leaving untouched the violence that arrives through institutions he trusts. To borrow Arendt while defending the machinery she would have recognized is not homage. It is vandalism. Worse, it is self-exemption disguised as moral seriousness. The Arendt borrower does not ask, "Where am I ordinary before evil? Where have I mistaken procedure for conscience? Where have I allowed allegiance to make certain bodies abstract? Where has my language participated in the cleansing of violence? Where have I been most respectable precisely when judgment required disgrace?" No. He asks where evil can be located safely outside himself. That is why the title itself stinks of theft. Not because one cannot speak of banality, but because one must first fear finding it in one's own house. 7. The emotional draft notice. I do not owe anyone sadness. I do not owe anyone happiness. I do not owe the spectacle my face. This is the part they cannot tolerate. Not merely disagreement, not even anger, but refusal of the emotional draft. After every event, the machine issues instructions: condemn, grieve, reaffirm, denounce, clarify, distance yourself, perform decency. Make sure the public record shows that your soul stood in the correct line at the correct hour. It is not enough to think. You must be seen feeling properly. The modern citizen is treated as a little press office of the self. Every event demands a statement. Every statement requires positioning. Every position requires the correct opening phrase. Before one can speak of empire, despair, collapse, violence, hypocrisy, or moral exhaustion, one must first establish that one is not dangerous. But the soul is not a press office. There are events before which the honest response is not the approved response. There are moments when grief does not arrive on command. There are moments when relief does not arrive either. There are moments when what appears is disgust, not at the blood alone, but at the machinery of interpretation that descends upon the blood before it is even dry. The demand for emotional choreography is itself a form of power. It tells you what must be foregrounded. It tells you which violence must be felt immediately, and which violence may be processed later, if at all. It tells you which dead require tears and which require analysis. It tells you when context is compassion and when context is forbidden. To refuse the script is not to praise the act. This distinction should not be difficult, but in a stupid age, even the obvious must be defended. One may refuse compulsory grief without celebrating harm. One may pity a perpetrator's ruin without endorsing his act. One may condemn a political culture without joining the chorus assembled to protect that culture from deeper indictment. I owe the truth my attention. I do not owe the spectacle my choreography. What I reject is not moral seriousness. I reject its counterfeit. I reject the expectation that I must borrow my first feeling from people whose own moral vision has been trained by proximity to power. I reject the notion that public virtue consists of saying the safe sentence before thinking the dangerous thought. Let them have their scripts. Let them gather in their digital chapels. Let them nod gravely as each man proves, once again, that he knows the words. I will not be conscripted into their liturgy. 8. The perpetrator and the abyss. The perpetrator is not a hero. He is not a prophet. He is not a revolutionary. He is not an answer. He is a ruined man who mistook violence for authorship. There is something almost unbearably pathetic in that. Not innocent. Pathetic. A person reaches the point where he believes that history will finally acknowledge him if he enters it through harm. He imagines interruption. He imagines significance. He imagines, perhaps, that a single act can tear the veil. But the machine is stronger than his fantasy. It does not break when he fires. It feeds. He becomes content. He becomes evidence. He becomes a chyron, a mugshot, a segment, a warning, a fundraising email, a moral object passed from hand to hand by the very people whose world he may have imagined himself attacking. He does not escape the spectacle. He completes it. The state will use him. The commentators will use him. The politicians will use him. The frightened will use him. The righteous will use him. The conspiracy merchants will use him. His life, already destroyed by his own act, will be processed into proof for everyone else's prior beliefs. This is the abyss. A man destroys his future, wounds his family, forfeits his name, and enters the permanent custody of the system he thought he was interrupting. That is not nobility. It is spiritual catastrophe. Pity is not endorsement. Only a morally illiterate culture thinks that pity means approval. To pity the ruined is to recognize the human wreckage beneath the category. It is to say that even the guilty are not merely symbols. It is to refuse the cheap satisfaction of turning a broken person into a useful monster. The commentator class needs monsters. Monsters simplify the sermon. Monsters allow the little priests to stand taller. Monsters make the existing order look sane by comparison. But often the monster is a man who has been swallowed by the very emptiness everyone else is paid not to describe. This does not absolve him. It indicts the age. Violence is false authorship. It promises the powerless a terrible grammar. Do this, and the world will finally read you. But the world does not read him. It consumes him. It translates his act into its own language and sells the translation back to the public as moral clarity. He thought he was interrupting the machine. He became material for it. The bullet did not break the spectacle. It completed it. 9. No more priests. The deepest crisis is not that people disagree about violence. The deepest crisis is that moral language itself has been made suspicious by those who use it most publicly. Democracy, decency, violence, extremism, civilization, law, order, evil, human rights, security, terror, genocide, peace, stability. These words have been handled too often by dirty institutions wearing clean gloves. They have been stretched, narrowed, weaponized, laundered, sentimentalized, and deployed until many people hear them not as moral language, but as management speech. A civilization does not collapse when evil speaks. It collapses when the language of good becomes unusable. That is what the little priests have done. Their crime is not only hypocrisy. Hypocrisy would be almost innocent. Their crime is that they have made moral speech sound like public relations. They have taken words that should tremble in the mouth and turned them into professional instruments. They have taught the public that condemnation often means alignment, that grief often means branding, that seriousness often means obedience to the frame. So, no, I will not join the chorus. I will not borrow my grief from men who discover humanity only when power trembles. I will not accept moral instruction from those who have mistaken proximity to institutions for wisdom. I will not be lectured on violence by people who have spent years helping violence appear civilized. I will not be summoned into emotional agreement by courtiers of a collapsing order. They are not moral teachers. They are not guardians of democracy. They are not interpreters of evil. They are not priests. They are functionaries with better lighting. Let them speak, if they must. Let them adjust the microphone. Let them summon Arendt, democracy, decency, civilization, all the old saints of respectable violence. Let them lower their voices and begin again with the sacred sentence. Let them condemn what is easy to condemn. Let them mourn what threatens the room they are standing in. Let them call it courage. But do not ask me to kneel. The altar is empty. The priests have lost the language. The sermon is over. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.